welcome you to the second lecture in the Ross and Marion Woodman Speaker Series in Romanticism, the result of a generous bequest from the Woodmans. If you don't know them, Marion was a Jungian analyst, teacher, and pioneer in the study of eating disorders. Ross was, since the 1950s until his retirement in 1986, a dominant force and teacher in Romantic studies at this university and a pioneer in the study of Romanticism itself, especially Blake and Shelley, starting with his 1964 monograph, The Apocalyptic Vision in the Poetry of Shelley, and ending in 2015 with Revelation and Knowledge, Romanticism, and Religious Faith, both with the University of Toronto Press, and I actually went out to the cemetery just yesterday to their tombstone to tell them what was going to be happening today, and they gave it their blessing. Quietly, but they gave it their blessing. Romanticism's powerful legacy is one shadow the future continues to cast on our experience, particularly the apocalyptic present in which we find ourselves, one that requires ceaseless mental fight more than ever. That's why we're here to celebrate the incredible scholarly and graduate teaching impact and legacy of Tolota Marajan. Which brings me to our keynote speaker, who I am privileged to introduce, David Collings. Dave is Emeritus Professor of English at, I'm not going to say it properly, Bowdoin College, thank you. He is the author of Wordsworthy Inerrancies with Johns Hopkins, 1994, Monstrous Society, Reciprocity, Discipline, and the Political Uncanny with Bucknell, Stolen Future, Broken Present, The Human Significance of Climate Change, and The Rubble of Culture, Debris of an Extinct Thought, both with Open Humanities Press, Disastrous Subjectivities, Romanticism, Modernity, and the Real and Blank Splendor, Mere Existence in British Romanticism, both with the University of Toronto Press. He co-edited Queer Romanticisms with Michael O'Rourke and Romanticism, a Disaster with Jacques Calip for Romantic Circles Practice. He's also served as the chair of the board of the North American Society for the Study of Romanticism, an essential, but I'm sure often thankless task for which you are owed many, many thanks. Every year at Romantic Studies conferences, I'd hear this refrain: why are there so many papers on Wordsworth? I think we can blame Dave's first monograph for that. Subtitle of book, The Poetics of Cultural Dismemberment, and you see the writing on the wall. For me, the most compelling study of Wordsworth over the past several decades, Wordsworthy Inerrancies establishes in all of Collings' subsequent work an attention to the drift or errancy of thought within the otherwise straight and narrow trajectory of progress. Collings radically revisions the poet of the Prospectus to the Recluse, one who promises an apocalypse of imagination that will transform the given terms of the world in which we live. There is an apocalypse going on in Wordsworth in Collings' hands, but it's of a dangerously unenlightened present that, as Adorno and Horkheimer claim, radiates disaster triumphant. The experience of this apocalypse without millennium, to borrow Morton Paley's phrase from a while back, entails what Collings also calls an affect without affect. We can't afford to feel too much because that's where modernity traps us. We also can't afford not to feel and think our way through that capture. As the blurb for Collings' 2019 Disastrous Subjectivities makes clear, quote, the demand to realize justice within history turns out to require more than history can make possible and more than the subject can bear. At this unavoidable, inexorable limit, that was the end of the quote, thought confronts extinction, which is also to say its own extinction, the subject of so much of Dave's later work. At this limit, we need to adapt differently to the rather treacherous terrain of existence. He calls this locus the traumatic sublime, the exploration of which marks Collings, like Rajan, as one of our most acute explorers of the Mobius strip that binds psychoanalysis to philosophy and our understanding of Romanticism. It's also the place where the neoliberal academy would rather we don't dwell because, well, thought itself is hard. Thought itself is hard. That's how I always think of it being said. Just get on with things. Don't think too much. Thankfully, that's not the world that Dave inhabits. I'm glad he thinks too much. I would guess it's the place many or most of us in the room inhabit, which makes returning to the visual incommensurability of Caspar David Friedrich's paintings more necessary than ever. Please join me in welcoming David Collings to present on the cut in the image, the discordant subject of Caspar David Friedrich. Welcome. No? Oh, I give it to you. He gives me good instructions, I have to say. There you go. Thank you.
So I guess this will be handy for something. I've never given a PowerPoint. My apologies. So Joel will have to instruct the monkey which button to push. Do I hit this one?
It's really terrible. Just push that one.
Thank you.
Are you going to be mod?
No,
This is,
that is only for the camera. There's no audio enhancement in the room.
okay. So I will speak up. Thank you, Jonathan. I did not realize that. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Joel, for your great introduction and for setting new standards for Menschheit, if I may turn a Yiddish word into a German one. And thank you to Tolodoma. Today and tomorrow I'm sure we've been hearing a lot from Tolodoma's former students who can bear witness to an astonishing presence as teacher, mentor, friend, colleague. I did not meet Tolodoma for many years after entering the profession. Nevertheless, she served for me as a pivotal figure from a great distance. When I entered graduate school and began work as a romanicist, she served as a model for me of an uncompromising, severe dedication to genuine negative critique. And as such, she held open for me the possibility of a kind of work I wanted to do, and has made my whole career possible. Because in some ways, her capacity for the negative has propped open the door that would otherwise have shut for me and for many of us in our field, limiting us to the positive and to the known. She made what would have been otherwise unbearable quite bearable and in fact joyful. So I am delighted to be a speaker at this symposium and even to be a keynote speaker to share my homage to Tolodoma. Thank you. And I'm going to do a little bit of a different thing and speak about painting. My whole career I've been writing about texts, coming back to the textual grounding of so much deconstruction as Mike has just spoke to us about. In my last book, Blank Splendor, my final chapter is about J.M.W. Turner. And I had such a great time writing about Turner's paintings that I realized I had to do at least one more round on painting before I ceased writing, if in fact I will cease writing. And so I researched Caspar David Friedrich and found a very simpatico figure, someone who shares many of the same concerns and does many things that are similar to the people I've been studying. So this is my foray into a little art criticism. I hope you can be generous to me as I do this little adventure. The talk should take about an hour, and we should have about half an hour for Q&A. So, and I hope you can hear all along a kind of murmurous subtext of a dialogue with many of you, with Tolodoma, with many others that I may not always have been able to put on the surface and make explicit. All right, the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich are well known for their, I'm going to first summarize the argument, and then I'll present the full argument. So this is just the beginning of my summary. The paintings of Caspar David Friedrich are well known for their intense interiority, their capacity to absorb depictions of landscape into the concerns of the viewing subject. Friedrich is often regarded as a painter of solitude and stillness, who treats the landscape as a means for symbolizing or even allegorizing interior states. Inheriting the canonic European tradition of high landscape painting, Friedrich often modifies it, subtly erasing many of a landscape's features until it becomes an austere delineation of pure affect. Yet several features of Friedrich's art complicate this account. Certain key paintings reveal his fascination with scenes that are indifferent to being perceived, that do not offer themselves to any human purposes. Thus, in his work, a powerful engagement with interiority arises alongside a sharp new awareness of the non-human. Together, these emphases point to the dissolution of a common ground between subject and world, so that each is in some sense stranded in a domain without the other. This situation speaks in part of the rise of a scientific understanding of natural processes, which brings in its wake a sense of the gap between humanity and its material preconditions. But this shift in turn points to a change in humanity's relation to transcendence, which had once provided a common ground for both in divine creation. Thus, it is fitting that this painter often meditates as well on the retreat of the divine. Friedrich addresses these concerns by creating a visual structure on which he relies throughout his career. A wide array of his paintings juxtapose foreground and background without mediation in the middle ground, making visible a discord between these two domains. Many of his images heighten the contrast between near and far with further divergences, such as those between dark and bright, interior and exterior, and even perspectival and non-perspectival representation. Through this reliance on a divided image, he attempts to capture an essential aspect of his core concern, the condition of a subject who is now in discord with itself, caught between its quotidian engagements and its capacity to register something that lies beyond them, something akin to what is, in Kantian parlance, the idea of infinity. Friedrich's exploration of this mode of visuality speaks of a profound alteration in the preconditions of subjectivity, a shift that aligns well with the Kantian intervention into the theory of the subject. On this basis, the painter takes further steps to consider several consequences of this alteration. In some paintings, he considers the cost of locating the capacity for the sublime within the subject, proposing that through this feature, the subject becomes its own obstacle, interrupting its access to the realm of ordinary experience. Moreover, he suggests that this affinity with excess traumatizes the subject's mode of embodiment, its endurance in the phenomenal world. In such moments, the subject's new condition not only creates dissonance between its features, but also thwarts and damages it. In all these strategies, the painter embarks on a mode one might well compare with what Tolodoma Rajan has theorized as romantic narrative. For within his idiom, he enacts a poetics that is, quote, a faculty or mode of thinking rather than a genre, end quote, which operates through, quote, an ongoing process of unmaking the codes reified by a culture buried in its institutions, end quote. He does so, however, by rethinking the resources not of narrative, but of visuality, calling upon the conventions of landscape painting while contesting them, unweaving their ideological closures to encounter what interrupts them. Moreover, within this context, his emphasis on interiority does not reify a self-identical subject. On the contrary, one may say of his paintings, as Rajan argues of romantic narratives, that if, quote, they interiorize narrative so as to conserve lyric identity, that identity is now articulated in terms of a splitting of the subject, end quote. Accordingly, he mobilizes a visual counterpart of what Rajan calls auto-narrative, enacting an autocritique not so much of any individual life, as auto-narrative can do, but of the less personal trajectory of the viewing subject, examining a range of impasses and deadlocks in its modes of apprehension. Thus, his work overall exemplifies an inexact but still telling counterpart of romantic narrative, what I will call, in the wake of Rajan's argument, romantic visuality. In the course of examining these questions, Friedrich at times radicalizes them further. In two remarkable paintings, he suggests that a fundamental development that underlies all of his explorations, the loss of the common ground between subject and world, not only creates a dissonance between them, but also undoes them both. At the limit of his work, Friedrich gestures toward a realization that, taken to its limits, romantic visuality suspends the viability of the visual itself. The cut in the image, in short, ultimately leads to an encounter with the erasure of the world. So that's the summary. All right. Friedrich's art frequently evokes a mood of serene contemplation in the depiction of a quiet landscape. A painting such as Morning in Mist in the Mountains, 1808, for example, depicts what seems to be the peak of a mountain in the upper center, beneath which appear several trees growing on the approach to its heights, all shrouded in a gentle, pervasive mist. The effect is one of a grandeur that is partially seen, but mostly felt, apprehended in a mood established in part by the pale blue-green color throughout the image. Here the obscuring of what is seen accentuates what is felt, so that the muting of the object world signifies an attempt to evoke an affective response from the subject. In this and countless other images, Friedrich becomes a painter of interiority, a master of the visual evocation of mood. Yet it is well to keep in mind such paintings as Trees and Bushes in the Snow from 1827 to 28, much later, which places alder trees in a scene whose ground is rendered in such a nebulous way that in the exemplary analysis of Joseph Leo Kerner, it, quote, causes the alders to appear as presences conjured up from a bottomless deep, end quote. Moreover, because, quote, the edges of the canvas appear as the limits of the thicket, the painting confounds any ordered progression of vision into depth, so that the thicket rises up abruptly as pure foreground, like a net woven over an abyss, end quote. As a result, he suggests, the painting evokes a scene that, quote, eludes the immediacy of one's experience, end quote. These two aspects of Friedrich's art, his capacity to absorb landscape into an intensely felt subjectivity and to depict a non-human world unmoved by its concerns, reveal two sides of a new condition within which a subject no longer embedded in the world confronts a world that no longer addresses it. In this respect, then, his work figures a distinctly post-Enlightenment view of landscape. But this shift in relation to the natural world arises in part because of humanity's altered relation to transcendence, which had previously been taken to be the foundation of creation. The commonality between subject and landscape, one could argue, relied on their being grounded in a shared divine origin and end. The severing of that commonality implies the loss of that shared ground, so that each had now become untethered, to some extent opaque or even indecipherable. Here another feature of the painter's work comes to the fore, his treatment of the complex, newly problematic status of the church within this altered world. In several paintings, Friedrich depicts a physical church, either in a state of ruin or floating above the ground in the distance, indicating that for him it can survive in no actual institution, but only as an idea that will remain unrealized, as in Winter Landscape with Church, 1811, as well as Vision of the Christian Church, 1812, Cloister Cemetery in the Snow, 1817, and so on. The alienation of landscape, in short, is accompanied in his work by an emphasis on the gap between an embodied historical scene and a domain above it in the mode of the virtual. Friedrich's retaining certain religious images, even in this context, indicates that he may share much with his contemporary, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who attempts to maintain a certain religiosity even in the wake of the Enlightenment and the interventions of German idealism. Werner Busch, drawing attention to these parallels, points out that Schleiermacher advocates for a new possibility for faith, founded on the ruins of the church. But this displacement of belief from a historically embodied tradition has severe consequences. Indeed, Busch argues that at times Friedrich is caught in the paradox of, quote, maintaining hope in the knowledge of hopelessness, end quotes, of holding to a transcendence that, utterly removed from the phenomenal domain, subsists in a region inaccessible to human apprehension. Such a transcendence is hard to distinguish from its absence. Its utterly alien status undermines the import of the subject and of experience alike. The key elements of Friedrich's art, then, testify to the loss of a secure ground for the natural world, the subject, and religious faith. But Friedrich does not stop with capturing the divergence between these regions, for he ponders how this loss also, and quite crucially, produces a situation in which certain fundamental aspects of subjectivity clash with others. In one of the most pervasive and consistent threads of his work, he captures this new condition by attending to the cracks within the visual field, cracks that everywhere invoke a range of further gaps. Rather than simply inheriting post-Enlightenment impasses, then, he theorizes their import for high art and for its attendant viewing subject with meticulous care, creating superb instances of romantic visuality. One of the most pivotal aspects of his intervention is visible in a pattern that Friedrich sustains across his career. As Werner Hoffmann demonstrates, it takes shape through what he calls a 3-beat rhythm that appears in 2 basic models, space ordered vertically in strips and horizontally in bands. In most cases, this rhythm places 2 substantial masses on either side of an opening, an abyss, a valley, a gap, or on either side of a barrier or wall. In High Mountain region, from 1824, for example, 2 precipitous inclines flank a V-shaped valley in the center, behind which one sees a mountain in the background. In the more telling horizontal model, a foreground gives way, with very little middle ground, to features in the distance. The scene in the foreground of Morning in the Mountains here is interrupted by a band of fog slanting across the center in the middle ground, behind which appears a series of mist-covered distant mountains. But here, as in some other cases, we see features of both the vertical and the horizontal models, because in this version we also see that V in the foreground, as if Friedrich wants to double down, give us both vertical and horizontal gaps to deal with. This 3-beat structure is most striking in the horizontal model, which I will be emphasizing hereafter, for it undercuts one of the premises of the tradition of European landscape painting, the notion of the viewer's implied movement, whether embodied or visual, from the foreground into the distance. That movement enlarged upon the conventions of perspectival representation, shaping the landscape in relation to the viewing subject's visual and physical modes of engagement. Friedrich interrupts this sequence, drawing attention to something that thwarts, interrupts, or cuts across the viewer's presumed pathway through space. Moreover, through this pattern, he suggests a vivid contrast between areas that belong to divergent modes of apprehension. He often creates a sharp distinction between the more intimate, defined scene in the foreground and a background that evokes a less firmly discerned possibility, a domain beyond what one can clearly understand, and thus more closely associated with what one must posit or imagine. This distant scene often contains a light that, in its radiant emptiness, contrasts with the darkness of a cemetery in the foreground, as in Abbey in the Oak Forest from 1809 to 10, the image of a floating phantasmatic church, as we've already seen in Winter Landscape, or vast ranges of mountains, as we've also seen in Morning in the Mountains. So we have a church, mountains, or an empty sky. And we'll return to this image later. You may not be able to see the gravestones very well, but they're in this region of the painting. It doesn't really show up that much better if I zoomed in. I've tried it, but it's basically a series of gravestones, and then this ruined church in the middle, and then these trees reaching up towards the sky with a little hint of the moon. This gap between what one can and cannot grasp thematizes a divergence not only between subjective and objective domains then, but also between 2 dimensions of the subject, between its ordinary engagements and a faculty that emerges in response to an experience that violates it, for example, death. On one level, such an implication follows through on that aspect of nature that refuses any human mastery. The thwarting of the viewer's movement hints that the landscape is not there for human purposes, and that it exceeds the demands that a viewer brings to bear upon it. But in doing so, it also draws attention to how the non-human scene, in Kantian terms, can trigger the mathematical sublime. The very fact that it is alien to a human viewer makes a certain type of subjective response possible. Those distant scenes designate a vastness that in consequence overrides what one can encompass, causing a painful scenario that one can exit only through the idea of infinity available to supersensible reason. In effect, then, the cut in the middle ground is the mark of the leap from the faculty of ordinary perception to one that recognizes itself in the idea. The gap between these faculties reveals a discord between aspects of mind that no further faculty can overcome or resolve, So that, as Jean-François Lyotard argues, this discord remains intact, undercutting the notion that Kant provides a philosophy of a unified subject. This discord between the mind's faculties is echoed in the formal structure of these paintings, which persistently accentuate a similar breach. In effect, Friedrich becomes a theorist of the visual different, proposing a counterpart to Kant's aesthetic theory in his own medium, or in a painterly medium. So he's doing Lyotard or Kant, but as a painter. Yet by bringing these concerns into the implied movement of the viewer through the landscape, Friedrich renders the Kantian autocritique of reason into what we might call, following Rajan, auto-narrative. This version of romantic narrative, she argues, quote, is a form of self-writing in which the author writes her life as a fictional narrative and thus consciously raises the question of the relationship between experience and its narrativization, end quote. For his part, Friedrich constructs a similarly self-conscious form through which he can examine the relationship between visual experience and its codification, subjecting the conventions of perspectival engagement to sustained critique. Many of his paintings then exemplify an auto-narrative of the visual subject, allowing him to explore the contours of a romantic visuality. In one of his most provocative explorations in this regard, Friedrich juxtaposes a foreshortened near scene and a distant vastness that he renders in a non-perspectival mode of representation. In Chalk Cliffs on Rügen, 1818 to 22, Rügen, by the way, is an island just north of Germany in the Baltic Sea, where Friedrich would spend time in the summer with family and friends. In this painting, the near scene features two trees on either side, framing three figures looking away from the viewer in the foreground, over a sheer drop just in front of them, behind which one sees the V shape of luminous, jagged cliffs, which in turn frame the sea. The two ships on the sea, I hope you can see them. There's one here, and there's one here. The two ships on the sea, one above and presumably farther away, and one below and presumably closer, are the same size, canceling a sense of perspective. Moreover, the horizon of the sea is placed much higher than convention would normally locate it. It is just beneath the foliage of the trees, arching above and actually not quite below, as you can see in some cases. The result is a vertical surface that looms up over the image with a startling alien intensity. Moreover, between the near and far are those blazingly white cliffs whose jagged, sharp surfaces seem capable of slicing the foreground from the background, cutting through the image with a stunning violence. Whereas in other paintings, Friedrich leaves the agency of the cut invisible, delineating its impact in a valley or abyss. In this painting, it is as if he dares to make that agency explicit in the serrated, invasive shapes of the cliffs. Pardon me, I'm going to grab my water so you can absorb the painting a little bit more. See if I can splash and make a sea. One might be tempted to identify this agency of the cliffs with an alien transcendence akin to the sort I referred to above. The hope in hopelessness, the Schleiermacher, the religious stuff, right? Perhaps Friedrich invokes a negated deity who becomes visible only through the marks of its violence against the available world. But such a reading is not borne out by the features of this painting. To depict that kind of intrusion, a painting would have to portray how a cut interrupts what is otherwise a continuous movement from foreground to background, introducing a gap within a trajectory whose near and far portions nevertheless remain intact. But this painting, in contrast, juxtaposes perspective and its absence. The naturalistic foreground in a nearly abstract rendition of a vertical sea, tracing a disjunction between realism and abstraction, or between Kantian imagination and supersensible reason. The negation of transcendence then leads not to the violence of a reified negative God against the contours of the visible, but rather a deadlock within the visible itself, a divergence between its codes of apprehension, analogous to a conflict between faculties of mind. Such a reading may seem to contest the direction Friedrich pursues in an earlier painting that initially established his reputation, Cross in the Mountains. Now you'll understand why I keep going on about Friedrich and religion, because that's how he made his reputation. This work violates the conventions of perspective so openly that it inspired the conservative critic F.W.B. von Ramdor to attack it at length, leading to a debate sustained enough to bring it to the public's attention. In his response, Friedrich made clear his wish to repudiate those conventions for his own purposes. Indeed, the image is not short of provocations. For one thing, as Kerner points out, the ground, as represented in the painting, passes well below where the viewer would presumably stand, forcing one to, quote, hover above the ground as it would pass below the canvas's lower limit, end quotes. For another, the contours of the mountain's shoulders remind one of the perspectival lines that lead into the distance. But in this case, quote, instead of converging at a vanishing point on the horizon, these lines construct the apex of a pyramid concealing any horizon, end quote. Rather than presenting either a horizon or ground as a reference point for this apex, the painting implies that the peak is surrounded by steep descents into the abyss. Moreover, in this image, a peak arises out of the abyss, evacuates the horizon in viewer's ground, and slices upward sharply, hinting at a still higher ascent. Indeed, because this pointed peak is the exact inverse of the V shape that appears so often in other paintings, including chalk cliffs, one might read it as a positive rendition of what elsewhere appears negatively. It might thus appear that this painting provides us with a figure that stands in for divine invisibility, making present what is otherwise absent in the visual field. But even as it opens up that possibility, it sets up a remarkable dissonance between two ways of evoking that absent transcendence. The symbol of the cross near its center, seemingly appropriate to a painting that is presented as an altarpiece, as the framework ordered by Friedrich, designed by his requests, makes clear, and the anti-perspectival inverted V of the mountain peak. The painting embeds a traditional symbol of divine grace within an image that powerfully violates the conventions of landscape painting. That violation is so palpable that it casts the traditional symbol into eclipse, as if to say that the reassurances of symbolic figuration must now be subsumed into gestures of disfiguration. This overall strategy marks a shift from the apparently stable logic of the symbol to the strategies of the avant-garde, through which the refusal of established codes of representation can make itself felt. Once again, here we move from the violence of a negated transcendence to a dissonance within the visual medium, to the impact of disfiguration itself. This painting thus suggests that the eclipse of the symbol brings with it a significant consequence. The retreat of the divine, in canceling the ground of the visible, undoes the foundations of painterly convention. In effect, then, for Friedrich as well as many others of the period, the cancellation of a knowable transcendence leads not to a comfortable embrace of finitude in history, but rather, as I have argued elsewhere, drawing on the work of John Kopchak, to the inscription of a no within history, a principle that endlessly interrupts its proper functioning. What one senses in this painting, then, is the movement from an aesthetics of the symbol to an art of the real, by which I mean the Lacanian real. Rather than simply barring access to an image of divinity, then, this painting goes much further. Friedrich shifts the viewer's focus from what lies beyond the visible world to a specific disorder in art's means of representation. Moreover, if one pauses to juxtapose this painting with the chalk cliffs, one can see still further implications of his stance. Would you like me to toggle? Make you dizzy? Those jagged cliffs, after all, rather than falling from a transcendental height, reveal interruptions in the land's surface caused by the Earth's constitutive processes. Here, the disjunctions of art evoke an incoherence that operates in a series of further domains, in the codes of perception and the modes of finite cognition, as we have seen, but also in the material processes of earthly life. The dissonances within figuration and in the subject point as well toward disorders in the earth systems that are the precondition for both. The disjoined subject has its counterpart in the impact of vast non-human forces that disrupt the earth's surfaces and thereby can potentially cast humanity itself into eclipse. But this is not all. The modernity of this painting, we're back to the cross in the mountains now, the modernity of this painting inheres in its status as artwork as well. The fact that Friedrich painted it in the form of an altarpiece, intending that it be regarded in some sense as a religious painting, might seem to contest the reading I am pursuing here. But the image's defiance of convention and its eventual fate show that it has a rather different status. The painter's repudiation of representational conventions makes clear that he intended it to be an original work, a display of his independent capacities as an artist. Moreover, he initially dedicated the work to King Gustav IV, Adolf of Sweden, but after the king was dethroned by a coup d'etat, a little inconvenient, the painter sold it to a patron who led him to believe it would be installed in a private chapel, although it was in fact fated to be hung instead in a private bedroom amongst other works of art. Neither painted to be encompassed in the contours of a sacred space, nor installed in one, ultimately finding its place within the oeuvre of the creative artist and on the walls of an art museum, the painting marks the shift from site-specific religious art to a modern conception of the placeless artwork. As a result, its fate calls to mind the transformation that art undergoes with the invention of the modern concept of art itself. In his exploration of the shift, Giorgio Agamben argues that in medieval Europe, a person looking at a work of art within a cathedral or church experienced it as one of many factors contributing to an overall sense of wonder at an, quote, indistinct presence of the grace that puts man's activity in tune with the divine world of creation, end quote. In contrast, the modern artwork, distinct from all other objects and designated for no particular site, invokes an, quote, artistic subjectivity, a pure formal creative principle that annihilates and dissolves every content in its continuous effort to transcend and actualize itself, end quote. And thus a subjectivity proper to the artist, who is now defined as the man without content. Rather than simply exemplifying Agamben's modern artwork, however, the odd fate of this painting enables us to place it just beyond the threshold of the artwork's emergence. Like most instances of a romantic aesthetics, this painting invokes attributes of tradition while subsuming them within a new perspective, within new imperatives. This juxtaposition of old and new is explicit in its mode of presentation, in the dissonance between a frame that alludes to the shape of an altarpiece and the painting's modern features. This dissonance, however, brings into view still broader patterns that emerge with the arrival of modernity, in which apparent continuity often appears alongside rupture. One might think here of what Reinhard Koselleck has depicted as the temporalization of history, that shift in the late 18th century from a bounded to an unbounded sense of historical possibility, a transformation brought about in part by the rapid pace of change in the era of revolution. In this context, it is significant that Friedrich often includes figures wearing Altdeutsch, or Old German costumes, in his paintings across his work, even after that costume was banned in Bavaria for its association with the demand for civil liberties. While this gesture has nationalist and traditionalist overtones, it also reveals a continuing commitment to the establishment of a democratic polity, and thus to a political process whose outcome, however eagerly sought, remains indeterminate and unknown. Notice I used the present tense in that sentence. That fidelity demonstrates that for Friedrich, history is a field of open possibilities. Friedrich's paintings then build on their other achievements to outline the condition of modern historicity itself, which suffers from a time that is caught between what has been superseded and the promise, perhaps unrealizable, of what is to come. The modern formation of the concept of art, whereby it revolves not around a shared and enduring framework, but rather a subjectivity perpetually breaking out of what is known, or what one might call a subjectivity without content, returns one to the question of the subject anew. As we have seen in many of his paintings, Friedrich displays the discord in the subject, exploring fissures in the mind akin to those that appear in Kant's critiques. But in other images, he complicates this approach through an alternative strategy, placing at the heart of the image a surrogate for the viewer who, gazing over all or part of the image, also blocks the actual viewer's ability to take in the scene. Yes, we did have to do this one, whichever. I almost wore my socks with this image up for the so famous. The figure seen from behind the Rückenfigur becomes an important aspect of his work, an ongoing feature of his meditations on the state of the subject. Weaving several threads of concern in this truly famous painting, he makes an important intervention. In Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog from 1818, a large dominant Rückenfigur gazes over a fog-enshrouded landscape of mountains. This painting immediately invokes its Kantian intertext. For Friedrich signals that the scene is sublime not on its own account, but rather for a human viewer. That is, for a mind that can overleap the excessive vastness of the scene by calling on the idea of infinity and thus recognizing that the sublime takes place not in nature, but in the mind itself. Making the Rückenfigur the central feature accentuates how it is not the scene, but the subject that is sublime. The paramount status of this figure is evident in the contours of the image, in the way that the various lines of the mountains and mists join at the center of the human form, right about his chest, or his back, I should say, as if the perspective's vanishing point in infinity belongs not to the scene, but to this figure. Here, landscape gives way to subject. Yet, as many commentators have pointed out, this figure blocks the actual viewer's ability, the ability of you and me, to encounter the scene, thwarting the opportunity to look at this landscape as an integrated whole. What appears in other paintings as an abyss, gap, or fault, which separates near and far, now arises as a large central obstacle between the two, an intrusion that, all too visible, thwarts the eye's movement in another way. The shift from abyss to obstacle, however, retains aspects of the abyss in the obstacle, and vice versa. And in this way, it revises Kant's account. The suggestions of this painting are so strong and yet so intricate that one must pause to work through them with some care. I hope my quick movement through this paragraph won't be too fast. We can return to this later if you'd like. If the capacity to experience the sublime in response to landscape is simultaneously the obstacle to one's view, then the element that intrudes into visual apprehension stems from a feature of the subject itself. In collapsing these two features into the single Rückenfigur, Friedrich proposes that what thwarts the subject's view is its own alien excess. In effect, then, the presence of supersensible reason in the mind is a force that disarranges one's access to the visual field. This painting reveals a deadlock within the terms of experience, suggesting that the mind is now an obstacle to itself, an interruption in its own functioning. The image at the center of The Wanderer is only one of many instances of the Rückenfigur across Friedrich's work. In virtually every case, the painter raises distinctive questions about the subject and viewing, ultimately using it to carry out a wide-ranging inquiry into important themes, most of which I cannot explore here. In Two Men by the Sea, at moonrise, for example, from 1817, two figures in Altdeutsch costume. That's what it looks like. There's an actual image of a costume he uses often, sort of as an act of protest, although this is 2 years before it was outlawed. Standing side by side near the center of the painting, gaze at a brightness in the distance, perhaps evoking Kant's notion of the sensus communis in aesthetic judgment, for example, since there are two figures rather than one. In Woman at the Window from 1822, in which the woman who looks through the window appears near the conjunction of inside and outside, hints that the viewing subject inhabiting one space can bring another into view. Also a beautiful Rückenfigur in that painting. Yet it is crucial that because the Rückenfigur is visible only from behind, it is impossible for the viewer to interpret aspects of the person that appear in the face. It is thus a kind of anti-portrait. It invites us to consider not the painterly evocations of an individual life or person, but rather a less visible feature of the subject, its unseen, abstract capacity for response. In effect, Friedrich presents us with a figure without content, experiencing a responsiveness without content, pointing to key aspects of aesthetics that are homologous to Agamben's artist without content. Moreover, since we see no visible traces of that responsiveness, we must place it in a region prior to or distinct from personhood, a region identified with modern philosophical conceptions of the subject. One senses that in this way Friedrich, like Kant, is theorizing the subject's capacity for aesthetic response. In his work, then, one finds a form of auto-narrative, not of the person, but of that philosophical subject. But because of these features of his work, Friedrich begins to move past the framework of Kantian critique, bringing into focus not a rational analysis of the gap between faculties, but the subjective import of that disunity, a key shift. Indeed, in such paintings as Wanderer, he captures what Rajan theorizes as an indigestible negativity, an auto-process thwarted by its incapacity to metabolize some of its own most crucial features. In doing so, he moves from autocritique to autoprocess, from Kant to a certain strand of Hegel, as well as from Lyotard to Lacan, from the differend to the real, as he proposes a theory of a subject undone by aspects of itself. To unpack this distinctive contribution of his work, one might best examine the entire question of the obstacle within Friedrich's visual field. So far, in tracing the implications of the three-part rhythm, I have emphasized how the artist's explorations of contrasts between near and far enable him to evoke a range of further disjunctions. These contrasts, as we have seen, often arise as a result of a missing middle ground between near and far. But they can also take the form of an obstacle extending across the image, blocking off from view a portion of what lies beyond, such as a low wall, a high wall with a gateway in the center, or the wall of a room with a small window. Elsewhere, however, Friedrich interrupts the eye's movement by depicting a central feature of the landscape itself that blocks the convergence of the lines of perspective in the distance. A telling pattern emerges in paintings that feature a central tree in its size and features that dominates the scene. Consider, for example, Village Landscape in Morning Light from 1822. Here a tree rises from a base in the foreground to partially screen a village and mountain in the distance. In its lower and middle regions, this tree continues to flourish, sharing the color of its foliage with several other trees in the middle ground on the right and left. But in its upper regions, above where one glimpses the mountains in the distance, where it goes up into the sky, its branches become bare, its twisted and jagged shape more pronounced. The eye's movement up the tree at least partially absorbs what would otherwise be its movement from near to far, the eye's movement from near to far, suggesting that the central tree has not only become the visual component of greatest visual interest, but also begins to carry the significance of the scene overall. But Friedrich does not stop there. At times he focuses so intently on the central tree that he discovers several further implications. The most signal instance in this respect is Oak Tree in the Snow from 1829, which focuses on a single tree with fierce intensity. Its dark, twisted branches either hold decayed leaves or are barren, and as the upper right portion of the tree reveals, a number of branches have fallen to earth. We can see them in the foreground, where several of them are lying. This tree, like others in this artist's work, is rendered with such attention and care, it takes on some of the attributes of human embodiment and becomes a kind of portrait.
In the Berlin version of this painting, one notices that here and there in the snow, near the fallen branches, appear patches of a rusty red color not far from the shade of human blood. In addition, as Nina Amstutz points out, in the crevices and ridges of the vertical striations of bark on the tree trunk, quote, strokes of dark reddish pigment shine through, almost like lacerations of the flesh, end quote. Even more strikingly, in the Cologne version, which I've included here, a watering hole in the foreground seems to have been recently, quote, seems to have been recently polluted by a thick, dark red ochre liquid, whose viscosity and color subtly suggest the physical properties of blood. And so it's right over here, some of these streaks in the pool looks like a puddle of blood between a tree that in effect is bleeding. Not just serving as an obstacle to the line of sight, as do its counterparts in other paintings, this tree instances what in embodiment thwarts the body's mastery of space and time more generally. Its mutilated, twisted, bleeding form evokes the mortal, ailing, traumatized human body. Here, Friedrich has expanded on the question of what blocks the perspectival view to consider what disarranges embodied life as such, bringing his investigation of phenomenal engagement to an even more intimate domain. Yet it does not follow that by taking this step he launches simply into an exploration of the human condition in the phenomenal domain, for in this move he conveys this concern through a non-human mode of life, raising anew the relation between human and non-human. In that case, one must reconsider the import of the many trees in Friedrich's work that intrude into the viewer's line of sight. Oak Tree suggests that in these paintings, the element that interrupts a clear view of the landscape, that disrupts the subject's visual mastery of the scene, is in part an aspect of the subject itself. But this element is not therefore absorbed into the subject, becoming a feature of a self-consistent interiority. On the contrary, it reveals something in the subject that, in Lacanian parlance, is extimate, at once external and intimate. It is an instance of an externality that interrupts and distorts subjectivity within it, that reveals something alien in the subject, a non-human feature of the apparently human. One can interpret this extimacy in at least two ways. On one level, the tree's broken, twisted, barren form makes palpable the deadlocks inherent in a subject's ordinary experience. The painter's frequent return to the image of the tree suggests that he wishes to elicit a force that disarranges the life of a tree and of the subject both, that makes each form of life dissonant within itself. In this respect, I would say he emphasizes what Andrew Sargent in his paper today called traumatic vitality. In that case, the painting evokes the dimension of the subject that, undone by its dispossessions and traumas, turns inward or contorts around itself, becoming involuted in its defenses and introspections. Since many of the trees in these portraits stand on snowy ground, they speak as well of that aspect of the subject which survives bleak seasons and harsh climates of another kind. But given the strong association between this tree and the question of the obstacle, this painting also points us to a second interpretation. How might one discern the import of this bleeding tree for Friedrich's sense of the subject as its own undoing? If, as I emphasized earlier, the various implications of the wanderer show that the subject's excess perpetually disrupts its relation to the visual field, it can, by the same token, perpetually remind the subject's ordinary faculty of mind, the imagination, that it is amenable to being traumatized by that idea. Here in Oak Tree, Friedrich suggests the consequences of that scenario. Seeking what it cannot grasp, injured by an attempt to reach across the gap between faculties, the subject experiences a mutilation. Having lost some of its upper branches, the tree reveals that it once aspired to reach the heights, but now suffers a form of collapse. Here are the incipient ruins of the subject, a striking counterpart to the ruins of a church, beside which, in Abbey in the oak forest, one sees several barren trees reaching upward in their twisted forms to the empty beyond. So there's a deep echo between these images. This portrait of the wounded tree discloses a dimension of the anti-portrait. So a portrait of a tree and an anti-portrait of the wanderer and of the Rücken figures, bringing to the fore the ruinous effects of installing in the subject an orientation to an infinity that it cannot secure. This suggestion appears in a stripped-down instance of the horizontal three-beat pattern as well, in another very famous image, Monk by the Sea of 1809, hinting that for Friedrich, the question of subjective mutilation is embedded in his explorations of romantic visuality overall. In this painting, Friedrich rethinks the aesthetics of sublimity in unusually explicit terms. Here again, one sees a solitary figure in the midst of a sublime scene, but this time each of the painting's three bands are barren, dispossessed of all but the most inconsequential features. There were a lot of other things going on in this painting at one point, but Friedrich painted them out, stripped it bare as much as he could. Rather than standing over a scene below him, this figure is dwarfed by this vastness. Have you actually noticed there is a monk over here? And there he is. You can, in person, I saw this in person just about a month ago in New York in the big Friedrich exhibit there. You can see his right ear and his beard. So we just know that barely know that he actually is, I guess, a human being, or a representation of a human being. But he is dwarfed by this vastness. But he is not completely overwhelmed by the non-human. The colors in that figure are partial inversions of those surrounding it, hinting that it is a feature that the landscape, despite its immense force, cannot expunge. As a result, it persists under the impress of that force, sustaining an alien excess it cannot absorb. Here again is a counterside of the Kantian sublime, a subject that suffers the force of what it cannot sustain. But the impact of that scene does not bear on the tiny figure alone. Because those three bands extend seemingly without limit beyond the picture's frame, because the foreground is so denuded and abstract it obliterates the place where the viewer is presumed to stand, the image engulfs the viewer in that alien space. The painting deprives one of any way to defend against its assault. In consequence, as Heinrich von Kleist famously wrote in his response, quote, "The viewer feels as though his eyelids had been cut off," end quote. Here the non-human is not merely indifferent to the viewer, as in the paintings of alder trees I discussed near the beginning of this talk, for it becomes actively hostile to the subject's receptive power, seemingly annihilating in its fierce assault. This image thus exemplifies Grave's contention that in certain Friedrich paintings, quote, "it is not what is represented, but the representation itself that becomes the locus of the viewer's experience of the sublime," end quote. Yet, as suggested above, the subject does not therefore disappear. On the contrary, it persists in part because, as Grave points out as well, the narrow band of the sea, thanks to it serving as a threshold between two other fields of color, quote, "cannot help but constantly move forwards and sink backwards," end quote, consigning the monk to a zone between these two fields in an image that never achieves resolution. The painting makes visible how subjectivity, belonging to neither domain, is caught in the violent disjunction between them. As a result, this painting, like Oak Tree, evokes the situation of a subject traumatized and undone under the force of a wounding excess, of an alien infinity without content, a situation that even the viewer of this painting might be said to share. Crushed by this painting, a viewer might well ask whether it rests at the limit of Friedrich's work, at the furthest verge of what he might wish to achieve. The barrenness of this world and the absolutely reduced version of the subject at its center suggest that this painting may be the purest statement of the three-beat pattern I have been exploring so far. Yet in at least two further paintings, Friedrich unfolds even further implications of these core concerns. In the first of these two paintings, another famous image, The Sea of Ice from 1823-4, Friedrich takes up once again the question of the non-human, this time within the radical reworking of perspective he has deployed in such paintings as Cross in the Mountains and Monk by the Sea. The result is remarkable. This painting depicts a shipwreck that has taken place amidst the ice of the Arctic Sea, but as it does so, it provides no ground for the viewer, since the jagged shards of ice extend so far into the foreground that they underlie the spot where one is presumed to stand. Indeed, as Michael Fried points out, they seem, quote, seem ready to contest the very possibility of taking an upright bearing, end quote. Even further, in contrast to many shipwreck scenes painted by Friedrich's contemporaries across several decades in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, including J.M.W. Turner and Theodor Géricault, it erases any apparent human implication of the disaster. It's not like the others. This has no real human implications. For other than the tilted, empty, and strangely inert ship, it seems there almost by accident, no trace of any human presence, no corpse, no piece of clothing, no sign whatsoever remains in those bleak regions. As Jacques Calippe points out in a brief but telling reading, the work, quote, paints an event that never happened, the shipwreck of William Parry's HMS Griper during his expedition to locate the Northwest Passage, end quote. Yet as he argues, one cannot contend that the painting tries, quote, to imagine what might have been, i.e. a spectacle of a shipwreck that never was, end quote. For instead it, quote, imagines a nothingness or non-event, a path never taken and stillborn in the materiality of the painting, end quote. The image captures a force that erases all events, that, quote, demolishes the very notion of world, end quote. Thus it makes even more evident what is already clear in Monk by the Sea. The non-human not only transpires without us, for it can also cancel humanity and its world entirely, can engulf us in its vast and ruthless process. What Friedrich initially proposes in Trees and Bushes in the Snow, with which I began, and radicalizes in Monk by the Sea, is now an overt meditation on the nullity of human being. Within these regions, a shipwreck is a minor affair, a routine and scarcely noted happening, for the indifferent movement of the ice readily absorbs the crushing of that mute ship in its aimless flow. It evokes not only the death of all human witnesses, but also the erasure even of signs of their deaths, as if to dissolve human absence itself. Here we see not just absence, but the absence of absence. Moreover, such a suggestion radically mutes an aesthetic response, for it proposes that a certain disaster has forever rendered such a response inoperable. It is not simply that one cannot find a footing in this image, any location in this scene, for the painting suggests that under the endless impact of that disaster, no scene, no place can possibly provide such a location. The image removes not only one's eyelids, then, to think back to Kleist, but by implication, the eyes as well. It hints at a scene without a subject, a domain into which no human figure can possibly intrude. Because of these implications, this painting marks a significant break from the three-beat pattern that shapes so much of Friedrich's other work. No longer does it present us with a cut in the image, the visual equivalent of a singular event, for it instead depicts a world that has been severed through and through. It is as if the cut has taken over the entire image and more. Where the jagged cliffs of Rügen slice between near and far, revealing the disjunctions within subjectivity and geology alike, here those icy shards engulf all regions, spilling out beyond the foreground to encompass what lies beyond its frame, leaving no remainder. What was once a specific cut has now become a scene that has never been anything other than an endless, boundless mutilation. But one must be cautious in interpreting this feature of the painting. Because of the centrality of the jagged ice, one might be tempted to argue that this image attempts to show how non-human material processes engulf and erase the subject. But such a reading would reify that materiality in a way that this painting does not. For this image conveys a scene in which that materiality harms itself, shatters its own domain, undoing its own apparent solidity so radically that the very categories on which my grammar has just relied, of agent and patient, are utterly dissolved. Thus, this painting captures a process that disables the codes for grasping what it entails, one that undoes the object world just as surely as the subject, the non-human as well as the human, bringing into view a mode prior to the emergence of either one. Thus, the painting anticipates with exemplary rigor what Maurice Blanchot, in the initial pages of The Writing of the Disaster, describes as a disaster that, quote, would come without arriving, in a non-event that ruins everything while leaving everything intact, end quote. A concept of the disaster through which, as I have written elsewhere in Blank Splendor, quote, the idea of a singular catastrophic interruption of reality gives way to a dislocation already inscribed within reality itself, end quotes. Such a disaster does not take place as a delimited interruption of ordinary experience, for it undoes that domain itself, taking us, as Blanchot contends, quote, outside being, end quote. This painting strikes so directly at the entire superstructure of the West that one might well ask how Friedrich could arrive at it from within the terms of his previous artistic practice. How did he get here? What Blanchot conveys in his difficult, breathtaking formulations, Friedrich manages to capture in the even more difficult medium of the visual. Yet this painting nevertheless retains links to Friedrich's prior work. By expanding the jagged cliffs of Rügen into an entire domain of mutilation, as I suggested above, it dislocates the terms on which he relies in many other paintings. The factor that causes Kantian subjectivity to become disjointed from itself now comes forth to dissolve all the arenas on which that earlier three-beat pattern relied: foreground and background, finite and infinite, imagination and the sublime. The painting thus suggests that a resolute focus on certain features of a, quote, indigestible negativity, end quote, eventually discloses what Rajan describes as a, quote, unusable negativity, end quote, if we can differentiate between those two. I'm taking a little liberty here, proposing that a certain self-disabling autoprocess, if deciphered further, reveals an underlying anonymous nullity, a process that takes place as what I might call a non-process. In effect, here he moves from, well, I'll say this in a minute. In exploring the shift, Friedrich also carries out the move I have elsewhere described from an aesthetics of an intrusive real, of a spectacular violation of the ordinary codes of cognition, to one of a blank real, a domain where experience itself is depleted. However astonishing this image, however bold in conceiving of a further step in the overall problematic, the Sea of Ice does not capture the ultimate phase of Friedrich's project. In referring back to prior insights in order to revise them and radicalize them, this painting retains signs of a prior aesthetic, just as by including that small tilted ship, it continues to gesture toward a humanity it has canceled. While it opens up the space for a painting of worklessness, to use Blanchot again, it still remains on the threshold of what it envisions. It has not yet made the full import of its intervention visible. To follow Friedrich in the furthest reaches of his work, then, one must consider an even more definitive painting, one that has received far less attention than the well-known images I have been considering so far. This is relatively unknown. One can see why it is relatively neglected. It seems to be about almost nothing, staging only the most minimal of scenes. But its radical understatement is precisely to the point. In Evening, there are two paintings entitled Evening from 1824. This is the October version in Mannheim. One sees only the evening sky and just barely along the lower edge, the waters of the sea. In this painting, there is neither landscape nor seascape, neither monk nor shipwreck, neither jagged cliffs nor shattered ice. But isn't this still a depiction of an evening over the sea, complete with little wisps of clouds that retreat into the distance according to the rules of perspective, thereby invoking the implied presence of a viewer? Yet notice how, along the bottom edge of the painting, perhaps I should do a close-up, but I don't know how, one looks not over the water, not at a scene that recedes from near to far, not at a seascape, but into the water from the side as it laps up against the bottom of the canvas and thus presumably flows over the place on which the viewer stands. I was lucky enough to see this in person again in the New York City exhibit a month ago and could really look closely. And it's just blue paint from the side. I was drowning like everybody else looking at this. Evidently, one who views the painting as submerged in the sea, or given these violations of convention, has already disappeared into these waters. But the painting does not hint at this surmise. It gives no sign, such as a drowning figure or a wrecked ship, that would indicate such a possibility. Instead, it evokes what cancels existence while letting it remain, just as it erases the image while allowing something to appear. The domain into which the sea of ice introduced us now appears without allusions, challenging us by delineating in all simplicity a domain without a subject or object, a scene without a scene. And there I'm deliberately echoing Blanchot. Disaster without disaster, being without being, etc. Evening thus enters into the poetics of what I have recently called mere existence, evoking that mode, as do several other works in the Romantic period, by gesturing toward a state stripped of nearly all the trappings of ordinary experience. Whereas others might figure that state through a night so dark that it retains no memory of day, or the light of a sun so extravagant it erases the features of the visible world, here Friedrich lurks on the edge of night, where certain wisps of clouds still remain, on the brink of a total dissolution, where existence lingers in a domain outside being. Here one sees an evening light that, like the eyes of Keats's Moneta, or certain paintings of the late Turner, shines with a blank splendor, as if to translate ever so slightly into a representational mode the sheer radiance of the void. Here, romantic visuality shows that, taken to its limit, it leads to the erasure of world. Thank you.
Dave, thank you so much for that brilliant talk. We have time for questions before we head up to the reception. Sorry, go ahead. Jan.
One.
Jan.
I have a very naive question because I'm not visual at all. But you spoke early about the horizontal and the vertical. And I'm struck by two things. First of all, how often it looks to me like the horizontal is vertical over and over again. But also, then you kept talking about V, the V shape and inverted Vs. And I kept wondering, is the V for vertical? And I kept wondering if there's a way in which those mountains or the gaps between them are somehow an eruption of language into the visual.
Well, I do like your Derridian sense of the sliding of the signifier here of the V in visual. That's great. The horizontal and vertical, just to simplify it, would be three vertical bands, right? And the middle one's missing. So you'd have two heights and something missing between them. That would be the horizontal model, so the vertical model. And it would be a V, right? So you're right. So there is a kind of pond there, whereas the horizontal version is foreground, middle ground, background, and there's something missing in the middle. In which case, it's hard to find the V. So I go with you, except that that messes with your argument a little bit. Where the middle, when it's missing in the horizontal mode, then what do we have? There is not an E, but is there an English letter that would capture that? I don't know.
Matthew.
Add a supplement to Jan's question. I also have been looking for writing in these paintings and mostly missing it, which is why I have always found Friedrich actually a little unsatisfying. Isn't there writing at the bottom of that
so
painting
what you see
in what
here,
you take to be the water?
This is October 1824. And over here you see Abend,
Thank you.
evening.
That seems very unusual in the context of the images you have been showing us to foreground the signature.
Absolutely. And there is this, but it's not a signature.
It's a signature, but not the
It's
artist's
not
signature.
Caspar David Friedrich.
It's
right?
not.
It's not.
the
It's
signature
not turned
of the
in
time of the moment.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Absolutely. So
Signature in
it's
Baudelairean sense.
yeah, signature of all things sets or whatever, some other kind of signature. A signature of what though? And so you might say this is a signature of a moment in which Friedrich encountered the absence of world. But then it's interesting that he had to sign that in effect by Abend, right?
Thank you, Dave. Really appreciated your reading of these paintings. And you're very convincing on your arguments about the interior scapes and the way that Friedrich was dealing with those. Could you repeat for me what the last sentence of your paper was, and then I'm going to ask my question, but I didn't quite catch the very end. I caught everything else that you said.
Absolutely. Sure, Susan.
It's the last word, erasure of what?
Of world.
Oh, of world. Thank you. Thanks. Well, that kind of feeds into the question that I was going to ask. Totally persuasive in terms of the sense of stillness and that exploration of a kind of lonely and isolated interior scape. Looking at this last painting, it put me in mind entirely of Wallace Stevens's last poem of Mere Being, with the poem at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought. And I wondered because Stevens engaged a great deal with Romantic period poetry, if you sort of see any affinity between, I don't know if you know that poem, between that poem and these paintings. The other thing that struck me about the paintings that you might want to respond to is, apart from the alpine scene with the sheep, I don't think there were any other living beings other than people and trees in the paintings. Was that because you chose those paintings, or are there other Friedrich paintings? I'm trying to think, because I sort of know many of his paintings.
Yeah.
There's none of the trees have birds in them.
But you do occasionally in a Friedrich painting see a bird in the sky.
Yes,
You do.
yeah.
So we do have living beings in that way, but not animals much. Plenty of plants and birds, but and people. And Wallace Stevens, it's interesting that goes into a symbolic domain, a pond.
Yeah.
And there's a bird on a tree. It's basically a Caribbean poem, maybe a Key West poem, right? And the fire-fangled feathers dangle down, the last line. So it's a beautiful poetic evocation of mere being's gorgeousness and sheer non-human sway. But I think Friedrich is more courageous here. We don't have any dangling down here. So I think the closer intertext is snowman, the snowman. One must have a mind of winter, right? And he speaks of the nothing that is not there and the nothing that is, and wobbles between what is there and what is not there. And so that, in many ways, it's a winter scene, which, of course, as we've seen, there are many winter scenes in Friedrich, which speak of presence and then non-presence at the same time. And the tree in the snow does use winter symbolically as space of the difficulty of phenomenal experience for human beings. So I think that the Stevens poem that's closest is Snowman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, David, for that. That was absolutely brilliant, and I was just tingled by so much of it along the way. And I loved the way you led us to the subject's excess in its disruption, and the disruption of its relation to the visual field. And that really hit home for me in a lot of ways. There's a lot going on verbally or in gerund form, I think, in the way you engage these paintings in a manner that really intrigued me in the best way possible. So the paintings are undoing, intervening, spinning, cutting, erasing, muting, doing many different things along the way. And so that led me to want to ask you about your thoughts about painting as a durational medium, that things happen in time. And I'm wondering if that temporality bears at all on your understanding of the interruption of the subject's relation to the visual field, if time is part of that process. I mean, you also described how we're led to move conventionally from the foreground to the background, but that's interrupted. So duration and your engagement with the visual here in relation to the subject.
That's great. And it obviously is famously a part of aesthetic theory to say that art is frozen in time, whereas music is temporal, and then literature has some sort of temporal status. So it would be cutting against convention to insist that there's a lot of temporality in Friedrich, but there certainly is, in just the ways you were suggesting, because of the, if nothing else, and Derrida does this himself, of course, in the famous Différance essay, that deferral is there in différance, but there's also spacing. Space and time, in some ways, are simultaneous, wouldn't be the word, but they're imbricated in each other within his problematic, and I think that would have to be the case in the Western art tradition as well, because of movement through space, movement's also in time. And the eye's movement is in time. And so our engagements with the medium are temporal. And then, of course, there's the temporality of history, as I referred to, with his engagements with a liberal German movement at the time, as well as his allusions to previous works and his revisionary responses to them. So there is the time of tradition and his response to religion, philosophy, and so on. So he's up to his ears in time, I agree. But it's very different. It's a little bit different to see someone do that in his medium. So I just think he's very distinctive, and he's really profound in that engagement in his career.
Thank you.
Yes, great questions.
Thank you.
I think Jonathan was next.
I think so.
Tolotima.
I'm not quite sure which way to speak.
You speak into the fluffy thing on the end.
You're doing great, Tolotima.
Oh, okay. So I have two then related questions. The first is really very vague. When I was a student, I read this. Are you familiar with Senancour's Obermann?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, is there any connection with that? And Büchner's Lenz is another similar text where I think you have somebody, going through a landscape but completely disconnected from it. And it's like a romantic version of L'Étranger. So that's one, it's an observation, but I just wondered if it resonated. My second question, though, is I'm also very much reminded of De Chirico when I see these paintings. Yeah. But the difference is that those are ruined architecture and this is nature. And so do you see, what would you make of that?
That's great. Great questions. Yes, for number one, absolutely. There is a deep affinity between those Obermann and Lenz, and the kind of plunge into affect in the landscape, which is those authors attempt to capture in a prose style and in a certain medium of the fictional marshalling of its protagonists, sort of the suspension of most plot elements, of other characters, of social engagement, etc. And so it's, aesthetically speaking, almost an exact counterpart of the first image with which I began. So, and it's contemporaneous work. So I would say that's almost an exact counterpart of certain moments in Friedrich, yes. In terms of Di Chirico, the thing that's interesting about him, who theorizes Di Chirico so brilliantly along the way amongst the theorists that we know in this room? I forget, maybe you will remember for me. But it strikes me that the way the sun, the light hits his characters and the way that they're totally frozen, it is almost like a surrealism of the detemporalized. Or is it even in this reality at all? It reminds me a little bit of Tanguy, the really crazy surrealist whom I adore, where it's not even on this planet. It's not on any other planet. They're just spiky objects and weird objects in this sort of completely denuded black space. Di Chirico doesn't go that far. He is architectural, as you said to Laurent. So it is this planet in the sense, okay, maybe some people were here and made these buildings. So his images are violent because they wipe out so much, but it's hard to imagine anyone ever moving through those spaces. Am I right about that? Does that feel right?
I mean, Tanguy seems different to me because it's more like an inscape. I mean, you're not sure whether it's inside or outside, and the shapes are sometimes like interior organs, but they've been put outside.
Extimate.
I feel there's less of a, there's a kind of denuded calm to what you're showing here, and I think that that's true of Di Chirico as well.
Which painting would be the most exact counterpart, do you think, of Di Chirico?
Which painting? I don't remember, I'm afraid. I'd have to go home and look. But.
Yeah, I like that comment. I'm open to that connection. Because, by the way, there are plenty of people who are interested in the connection between Friedrich and modernism, especially the abstract painters.
But the question would be why? What is the difference between having that kind of essential solitude, as Blanchot would call it, in nature, and having it not exactly in an urban setting, but a setting that is, well, I mean, it's got architecture in it, but it's not modern. I mean, Di Chirico's settings are not modern.
I mean, it's interesting that Friedrich is still invested in landscape so much. He is truly invested in landscape, and he's truly invested in all the associations that landscape brings. And Di Chirico is very urban. These are all built scenes. These are all basically flat, paved walkways and buildings. So in that way, they're quite different. I think this is an interesting painting because the abstraction of the sea in the background does hint at modern abstract representation. But what's interesting for me about Friedrich is that it's simultaneously representative and abstract. And so we get that cut, the edge between the two, and we don't get that in, say, Rothko. So I would say this is more dangerous and more radical, more disturbing than Rothko, etc. In many ways, I would say Friedrich. I don't know. I love the surrealists, so I don't know if I would compare him as better than they, because they may actually be doing similar things.
Thank you for this, David, which was thrillingly suggestive and interpretive throughout. Susan and I search in the galleries of Germany and England and America for Caspar David Friedrich paintings. We're obsessed by him. And we want to understand something which is very, very challenging to understanding. I want to ask one question and maybe make one slight criticism. It's about figures from behind, the question. The Enlightenment and the Renaissance present us figures full face, and we're presented, and they're sometimes in landscapes. In Gainsborough, they're often landscapes owned by the figures that are presented full face. It's a presentation of the figures and their possession, their world of possession. But Friedrich reverses that, and we no longer have to contend with personality before us. And so what I want to suggest is that figures seen from behind are not necessarily obstructing a view, but as it were, they're looking into the landscape just as the viewer is looking into the landscape. They're almost an invitation reminding you that this is the way we're contemplating. And if we see those figures from behind, there's no way we're led to try to interpret the figure first before, as it were, trying to piece out what the landscape is doing or saying. Do you
Lovely.
see?
Yes, absolutely lovely.
And there's a very great painting, I believe, not by Caspar David Friedrich, and you may not know it. It's a fresco in Venice by Gian Domenico Tiepolo, the son of Giambattista Tiepolo, and it's an early 19th century painting called the Mondo Nuovo, or the New World. And it's not of a single figure, but the whole of Venetian society, seen from behind, looking into a theatrette where somebody demonstrating a Mondo Nuovo is doing the demonstration. But behind that is a water, and behind that is an infinitude, just as in Caspar David Friedrich. And the dates are similar. It's a painting of, I think, 1812, and it was set in their private villa in Mestre. It was set in the Tiepolo's private villa in Mestre. But it's interesting that it's called the New World. It's as though, if that title is by Giambattista Tiepolo, and I'm not even sure that it is, but these Mondi Nuovi were also devices for viewing, so it could be just named after the device that the conjurer is using. But nevertheless, we see Venetian society post its being handed by Napoleon over to Austria, from behind, and some idea that the world is no longer that of Europe, but some new world, and we're seeing it as the viewers of the painting, but the people in the painting, who are Venetian society, are also looking out to it.
Fabulous.
My only criticism was this. You perhaps tackled every painting as a painting with a thesis, if it could only be unlocked. As it were, the paintings were image à thèse, if you see what I mean. And I wonder, can you at all respond to that? That they were mysteries that perhaps were puzzles we could almost work out if we were astute enough to do so. And I wonder if, well, maybe that's the way Friedrich intended them, to somehow be reflections on a philosophy or a divinity or an infinitude, by those terms, which are verbal terms, not visual. Do you see what I'm kind of asking there? Are the paintings theses, as I almost felt you leaning towards suggesting they were?
Okay, great. So two key questions. Let's go to the Rücken figure and then go to the thesis. Is it possible that the Rücken figure is not obstructive, but actually is inviting us in? Well, I would say there's a strong parallel between the Rücken figure and, say, a first-person narrator.
Between that and?
First-person narrator.
Oh, yeah.
So because we just had a session on Godwin, I'll pick on Godwin here. When we are with Caleb, we're watching all kinds of things happen through Caleb's eyes, but we're also following along with Caleb and watching Caleb. So absolutely, there is an invitation into a scene, and as I talked about the Rücken figure as a figure of our own responsiveness and of Friedrich's meditations on aesthetic responsiveness. So this is part of the argument. But it's also the case that we are also, as philosophers of aesthetics are, they are interested in the person who is responding. And as a literary novelist would be, they're interested in that first person. So what I'm doing is suggesting that Friedrich is doing that as well. He shifts focus as well to the figure who was seeing and who was looking. So that's a deflection from the scene to the figure. In effect, he's doing the visual equivalent of what art theory, art history does. Art thinking does, and it shifts from the landscape per se to the codes that shape our ways of viewing. So Friedrich is very much continuous with these other discourses, I would say. And are all these paintings theses? Well, I would argue that most of the time what I'm describing here operates on the emotional level, right? Something like this. Mostly we understand Friedrich when we can feel what he's doing. Or, pardon me for flipping around here, when we encounter the bleeding tree, right? So if there are theses, these are theses that speak less from a thesis than from an attempt of our spirit to find refuge in speech. What is not actually coming back to where we began with Jung's question is not in speech, it's not in writing, and it makes it difficult and strange, right? So, I probably turned them into theses when they are mostly about evocations.
We're a tad over time, and I really hate to shut down the conversation, but we can continue it upstairs at the reception, which we can all repair to. Please join me in thanking our amazing speaker.